evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here, either here at the Keller Center or via live stream throughout Chicagoland and beyond. My name is Sadia Sindhu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government here at the Harris School of Public Policy. We're so thrilled to welcome you to the Capstone event for Reimagine Chicago, our joint series with WBEZ's daily talk show, Reset. You'll hear much more about the series shortly from Sasha Ann Simons, the host of WBEZ's Reset and our moderator for the evening. Thank you, Sasha, for being here, alongside with your wonderful colleagues at Reset and WBEZ, many of whom are here tonight in person or watching us via live stream, for being such great partners in this work and helping us give voice to these big and bold ideas that came out of this project. Before I hand it off to Sasha to begin our program, I just want to thank some of the many others who have been part of Reimagine Chicago. First, to the countless experts, the civic leaders, and the community members who contributed to the series. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your experiences, and your important perspectives on these issues. To my colleagues at the Center for Effective Government and the University of Chicago, and to our partners at WBEZ, thank you for your tireless efforts over the better part of the last year to make this happen. This project has pushed everyone to think bigger about ways our institutions can better serve us right here in Chicago, and it's consulted leaders like the ones you'll hear from tonight about how these changes can happen, what effects they'll have, and frankly, what stands in the way. To those ends, Reimagine Chicago is right here at home at the Center for Effective Government, which builds bridges between those who recognize the need for deep structural reforms in service of a more effective government and trains the very leaders that make that change happen. We're also so thankful to have a home for this event, for our center, and for the Reimagine Chicago series at the Harris School, with so many of the best students and experts studying ways to solve our most pressing, challenging problems, and where so many of the ideas we grapple with are born, rigorously analyzed, and shared far beyond our campus. The Harris Family Foundation King Harris Forum, where this event is taking place, represents a key policy story of the Harris School and the Keller Center. The ash trees in this forum come from trees in Chicago's South and West Side parks. The trees infested by the emerald ash borer beetle were a hazard and as a result had to be felled. Artist and leader in ethical redevelopment, Theaster Gates, senior advisor for cultural innovation and advisor to the Dean of Harris, reclaimed that wood for use in art and building fabrication projects. Through his Dorchester Industries mills on the south side of Chicago, local residents milled the wood, which appears in the forum and throughout the Keller Center. Reimagining has always been a core part of the Harris School's approach to policy. Thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoy the program. But before I turn it over, just a few quick notes. For those of you who are here in person with us, we ask that you please keep your face covering over your nose and mouth at all times during the program. We also ask that you please silence your electronic devices. Following the program, we invite you to continue the conversation upstairs in the Commons, where boxed refreshments will be served, and while there, we invite you to check out the special part of tonight's program. A new art installation created this month by Chicago artist David Anthony Geary, which recaptures some of the materials and ideas from Reimagine Chicago in a beautiful and compelling way. David will be around after this event and looks forward to chatting with you all. This art will be on a display at the Keller Center for the next year. Thank you, David, for being a part of this project and for your wonderful work. With that, I will turn things over to Sasha, our moderator this evening, and CEG Director and Professor William Howell to get us started. Please join me in welcoming them.
This new normal. Thank you, Sadia. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making it out tonight. It's so good to see you all in person. Can you believe we're doing this? And virtually, of course, for this capstone event for Reimagine Chicago. This project actually started as a series of conversations between WBEZ and the university about how this pandemic was sort of changing everything around us. You know, it was changing our world and how so many parts of our day-to-day experiences had to just be reimagined. We had to sort of rethink how we would do things and adapt to this changing reality. So from that broad idea, we decided to sort of scale it down, take a more narrow focus. And first we wanted to talk about Chicago. our city, which makes sense. And then we thought, okay, why not broaden it out a little bit more? We wanted to understand how institutions and systems work here and how they could work better for the people who live here. So Reimagine Chicago took the form of more than 20 conversations on WBEZ's daily talk show called Reset. And they happened through the summer, May to August. It was a series of live events as well, and digital and social media content. And it also took us around the city, around the country, and the globe. We learned things like how European nations, they've managed to have so few police shootings compared to what we see here. We learned that what happens in my hometown, I'm from Toronto, and we learned how things worked when they decided to completely change the structure of their city council. We also talked to experts and we talked to regular folks from right here in Chicago about how we can all work together to improve our city and our home. So now we're here, and after those 4 months of conversations, we land at tonight's Capstone event. And it's really great to be in this beautiful space, of course. This is the Keller Center, which is the new home of U of C's Harris School of Public Policy. It's a place where everyday students gather here, and professors, and they're studying how to solve some of the world's most pressing problems. It's also the home to the Center for Effective Government, which is Reset's partner on this entire series, Reimagine Chicago. So here with us now, of course, only fitting, is the center's director, Will Howell. Come on up, Will. Will is the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics here at Harris. He's the chair of the Political Science Department at U Chicago. He's the co-host of the Not Another Politics podcast. And you're also the guy who, throughout the project, you always reminded us not to lose sight of what I mentioned, the institutions, the systems, and how they play out in our lives here in Chicago. So everyone, big hand of applause for Will. So I want to start there, Will. Tell us why you think it's so important when you think of this project, not just to talk about the problem and the solution, which is something that we constantly keep at the forefront on Reset, but you wanted to examine the very structures of city government, the very structure of the education systems here. Why?
So, first of all, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be here.
You too.
And in person.
We've talked a number of times and never met until 5 minutes ago.
And now we're, well, appropriately
Now you're
citizens
real.
together. Yeah, it's very nice. Conversations about how our city is doing, I think, tend to fixate on very local things, something that went horribly wrong, some kind of scandal, something that just wasn't performing as we think it ought to. And there's a lot of reason to raise up those considerations and bring them to the fore. What we tried to do, though, in our show is to say, wait, what those policies are, what those actions were, where things went wrong is a function of how we come together. It's a function of institutions that assign power to people and who have well-defined incentives and face well-defined constraints. And given the persistence of the problems that the city that we love is confronting, I think what we tried to do is to say, let's try to pan back and make sense of what those institutional arrangements look like that do so much in shaping our own thoughts about what's possible and doing so much in shaping what actual policies get enacted.
Yeah. And we brought with us a couple of examples from the first part of our series where we talked about the structure of Chicago's City Council and how it compares with very different systems in Toronto, as I mentioned, which is where I'm from. We also looked at Phoenix, Arizona, and I want to play a little sound from that. Let's take a listen.
We really need to do a hard reset on the city council. We need to start to restructure things where those executive, administrative, localized functions are pulled out of the city council.
A bank that would operate like a public utility, providing goods and services for the people, instead of shipping money to Wall Street, which is what we love to do here in Chicago, you keep it circulating locally.
You know, we need to spread out some of the responsibilities that have been placed on police and realize that they are not the best people to be responding to mental health crises.
You got to give, a school what it needs. But in terms of a system, I would have a system where schools do not rely on property taxes as their main source of income, because you're just setting up a system of haves and have-nots.
Those are just some of the voices.
We have a strong mayor.
They keep coming.
They keep coming. And there are more. Is there more? Okay. Those are just some of the voices, though, that we heard from around the world. I wonder what goes through your mind when you hear that back.
I mean, I love hearing that because, look, take the city council example. We started there, right? It's not obvious that the way we attend to the challenges that our city face through a city council is that we chop up the city into 50 different wards and we elect people one at a time, right? And there are many cities that behave very differently, confront the challenges that they face through very different kinds of structures. And that particular structure leads to the sort of lifting up of certain kinds of voices, but the suppression of others. And the attention to problems in certain kinds of ways that aren't obviously optimal. And so I think what we got a sample of there was a challenge to all of us to think anew and to think expansively and to reimagine our city, how we might come together.
Yeah, and like you, I was really glad that we started the conversations about city government. Selfishly, I'm new to Chicago, so I was like, great, this is an opportunity for me to learn. This is homework. But as we started to dig in, I was like, okay, this is really interesting stuff. First of all, it works very differently from what I've experienced. And this is really interesting. Now I kind of understand where some of the problems are coming from. Everyone who lives in Chicago, whether they think about it much or not, is directly affected by the decisions of the mayor, right? Their aldermen, other public officials. So it was really interesting to me, being new to this town, just to learn what kind of powers Mayor Lightfoot has.
Yes.
Who knew?
Yes, and they're considerable, right?
Yeah.
We have a strong mayor city, and so we want to think then about, well, is that optimal for not just the representation of different kinds of voices, but also our ability to meet the challenges that our city faces.
What were some of your favorite parts of this series, Will?
Oh, there were lots. Here's one that I thought carried through in a couple of the discussions, which was attention to the role of unions in the education space and in the public safety space. And unions are important not just for the support for and the voice that they give to labor, but they also are crucially important for the shaping of public policy. And so when you think of collective decision making, in collective bargaining, and what goes into the collective bargaining agreement, policy is being shaped in really vital ways. And attention paid to that, which I think we don't pay enough attention to. I think we tend to see it as this is just about the representation of interests of teachers, which it decidedly is in the education space, but it's also about the creation of policy. And policy can be made in lots of different ways, and that we took some time to hone in on that was, I think, really important. And I think more attention is due to think about, well, what kinds of policies ought we to be shaping and be setting in this particular space? More thought needs to be given to that.
And it wasn't just about our conversations on the radio. What I really enjoyed was our level of engagement with the people listening. So we took every opportunity possible to solicit voicemails, emails, like tell us what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what's on your mind, what's most important to you. And one of my favorite moments was when we talked early on, so this was in the city government portion of the series, and we were talking about aldermanic powers, right? And we brought on two residents, two different neighborhoods, and two different perspectives on their relationships with their aldermen. And they were just kind of sharing. One was, oh, I can never reach my alderman. This and that is wrong in my neighborhood, and we can't get a hold of her. She's never available. And then the other was like, well, here's how I tackle it. I reach out to them and I don't stop until I get a response. I show up to all the meetings. And you had this moment on the air of like older woman, younger man, just kind of schooling him and telling him like, here's how you get involved. And I want the younger people like you to get out and get involved because that creates major change. And just listening to that happen right there in the middle of Reimagine Chicago, I thought was beautiful. Before that, we had played voicemails of other listeners who we solicited. We played like 2 minutes worth of people just kind of talking to us about their neighborhood and what they love about their alderman or what they can't stand about how things work. But I just love that coming together of community.
Yes, and so some of that has to do with sharing, kind of pro tips on how to navigate an existing system.
Yeah.
But then in the background is a challenge to all of us to say, well, maybe we ought to reimagine that system. Maybe we ought to reconsider how that system is defined and reallocate power, rethink the design of institutions so that the way you get a hold of an alderman is not just by hitting redial over and over and over and over again until you eventually get through.
So important. Examining institutions and systems was one organizing principle for Reimagine Chicago, but another was taking creative solutions that were proposed by the guests directly to public officials who are in power. So it wasn't just come on air and just rant and tell us your problems. No, we're going to take these and we're going to actually present them to folks who can make decisions about what it is that you're suggesting or the solutions you're proposing. So here's a little bit of what that sounded like.
We really need to do a hard reset on the city council. We need to start to restructure things where those executive, administrative, localized functions are pulled out of the city council.
A bank that would operate like a public utility, providing goods and services for the people, instead of shipping money to Wall Street, which is what we love to do here in Chicago, you keep it circulating locally.
You know, we need to spread out some of the responsibilities that have been placed on police and realize that they are not the best people to
Do we have the second clip?
Responding to mental health.
We have a strong mayor system in that the mayor appoints all of the key committees or department heads of city government and many of the agencies.
I was one alderman among 50, and if I really wanted to have an impact legislatively, then I would really have to get support from, you know, at least 26 of the other aldermen, and get that support against what was usually a very strong mayor who had an opposing point of view.
The Canadian system of municipal government is widely recognized as being a weak mayor system. Really, it means that the mayor is more like another member of council than unlike another member of council.
If you look at the success that Phoenix has exhibited over the last several decades, I think you would be hard-pressed to conclude that the council manager system inhibited us in any way.
In council manager government, the mayor and the city council hire only the city manager. And so their relationship with the manager is sort of like a board of directors to a CEO.
So as I mentioned, well, we put leaders on the spot in these interviews and we asked them, could this idea work in Chicago?
And this plays out in a variety of ways, right? One is you might think about a system that works really well for Los Angeles, and we looked at Los Angeles too, may not make sense for Chicago, right? There's not like some single ideal, and it's just the challenge is for us all to figure out what it is and simply download it. There's that. But even so, when we brought the ideas then to people who in positions of power here in Chicago, sometimes the response is to say, well, that won't make sense because it is going to present a challenge to what I've got going on. And the system's working pretty well for me. It's not working overall pretty well, but it's working pretty well for me. And then to challenge them and to push back. On the other hand, there's also our moments where people who are good public stewards, who want to make the city a better place, are pretty frustrated, I think, with the way things are going, right? And they want to see change. And so they would love nothing more than for some reimagining to happen and some reallocation of authority.
Absolutely. So I want to point out, especially in some of our previous live events, a lot of interesting ideas came straight from you, from the public, from listeners, through Facebook, through YouTube. So folks watching, we want to bring you into the conversation. We'll have some time for a Q&A after the panel discussion, but we want to invite those of you listening at home and those of you using live stream to use the comments section and chime in to ask questions that you want to ask to our panelists. And you can also ask questions on Twitter by using the hashtag #ReimagineChicagoCapstone. We'll be sure to make sure that some of your questions get to the panel along with questions from the in-person audience. Before we turn to the panel, Will, I'm wondering how you think Reimagine Chicago has made you personally rethink or reimagine your work, or maybe even just your role as a citizen of Chicago.
So my work is, I do a lot of work on the American presidency. I think about national politics. I think it's what I mostly write on in my scholarship. And I think a lot about concerns about democratic backsliding. Both domestically and abroad. And I think a thing that I'm struck by here is that locally, in many ways, these issues are playing out in much the same way. That isn't to say that Chicago is just a microcosm of the country or of the world. There are things that are distinctive about our fabulous city. But the stakes here, when we think about the health of a democracy, the ability of our government to meet the needs of people, the frustration that any number of populations feel, here within our city is something that's playing out at a much larger scale around the country and around the globe.
I love that. For us on Reset, the approach was something that we're going to continue to work into our programming. This goes well beyond 4 months, right? We had this focus on systems and institutions. We're going to continue that on Reset, on the program. We had the focus on solutions, not just the problems. A broad lens where we're not just looking at Chicago, but we're comparing Chicago to other places around the world. I'm very big on that. You know, this really helps listeners to get a full picture, especially if they've only ever been in Chicago. Like, it's great to see how things work elsewhere. And this idea of challenging public officials to really just broaden their minds along with us. So a big round of applause, guys, to Will Howell, Director of UofC's Center for Effective Government here at the Harris School of Public Policy. Great teaming up with you, Will. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, panelists, you can come on up. All right, let's get to our wonderful panel. These are the folks that are here to help us continue to reimagine Chicago. So HELEN Gale is president and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, which helps donors make their philanthropy impact across Chicagoland. Martin Torres is first assistant deputy governor for education in the Pritzker administration and the former associate director of the Latino Policy Forum. He's also an alum of the Center for Effective Government's Civic Leadership Academy and the Harris School of Public Policy. Joe Ferguson, of course, is the Inspector General for the City of Chicago, and someone that we've all gotten to know well during these unprecedented times in the green, Chicago's top doctor, Dr. Allison Arwady. She is Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Public Health and also a Civic Leadership Academy alum and just my hero. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. So I want to start off at the very beginning. We've already acknowledged that COVID-19, this pandemic, it's kind of been a nightmare. It's focused us, and forced us to reimagine pretty much everything that we do, our lives, our work. So each of you, I want to ask you as a kind of introduction to our audience, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how the last 18 months has forced you to reimagine your work. You want to start, Martin?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and be involved in this event. I don't know that I've had a real opportunity to step back and reflect on the last 18 months. I'll start as an individual. My wife and I have 2 children, a 5th grader and a 3rd grader, and so we spent the last 18 months thinking about how their education has affected them, what we need to do for them, how remote learning is working for them, how going back to school is working for them, how do they feel, the social and emotional aspect of what that's like, and the fact that we're continuing to run the clock so they can have access to a vaccine. My wife is a nurse practitioner who immediately was thrown into COVID testing at the beginning of the pandemic, and I remember the first several weeks of that when PPE was a legitimate issue, and she was scared and fearful, and we were all trying to figure out how to navigate that. Professionally, it more than reimagining, it fundamentally changed every aspect of what we do in the governor's office. And after March 12th, when the governor issued the first disaster proclamation, our work, our day-to-day work completely stopped, and we were all shifted into some form of emergency management. And for several months, we were working 7 days a week, and some folks were in charge of drafting sector-by-sector guidance so that folks knew how to operate. Some folks were working on teams to secure masks and PPE and ventilators. And I was thrown on a testing team with IDPH and calling our universities to figure out if they have CLIA-certified labs and what their testing equipment is like. Or on the phone with Thermo Fisher, a global manufacturer, to figure out how I can negotiate a better supply of products to the state of Illinois. And it's never gone back to a normal day-to-day operation. It is COVID mitigation, COVID response is the primary lens through which every decision is made in the executive branch and the primary decision that the governor uses to evaluate everything.
Yeah.
And Well, I wish we were past this, but we need
We
to
all do.
continue to push vaccines and
Yeah.
combat vaccine hesitancy. So.
Absolutely. Helene, how about you?
Yeah, so first of all, let me add my thanks and appreciation for having this opportunity to talk about reimagining Chicago as we think about reimagining just about everything post-COVID. You know, I came here about 4 years ago to head the Chicago Community Trust, which is the foundation that focuses on the Chicago region. And when I came, you know, we kind of took that opportunity to step back and think about how we could reimagine the work of the Chicago Community Trust. And we were, at that time, like so many foundations, organized fairly traditionally. We had an arts program, we had a education program, a health program, and kind of the silos that are our traditional philanthropic silos. But we wanted to think about how we could have a greater impact on the Chicago region. And one of the I always like to think about how do you look for the root causes, not just the symptoms of issues, but how do you actually look at the root causes. And when we stepped back and thought about, whether it was violence or education, health, et cetera, at the root cause of that was the persistent wealth inequality that we face here in Chicago, as well as, so many other urban areas. And that wealth inequality in many ways was very linked to a past of racial segregation and discrimination. And so we decided that where we felt we could make our greatest impact was focusing on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And I think what COVID did was to actually amplify some of that. And we know that, the inequities that we saw during the COVID and are seeing during the COVID pandemic, which is not just the health inequities, but also, this is the first time we've had a health pandemic that has exacerbated economic inequalities, and where we have had an economic crisis that was caused by a public health crisis. And so as COVID evolved and as we saw the greater inequity both in health and economic, it only amplified the work that we were already doing. And I think when we first started talking about closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, for many people, it wasn't so clear and it wasn't as obvious. And I think COVID amplified that in so many ways. And I think it made it more obvious why a focus on inequity and looking at things through an equity lens was so critical. And at the same time, I think we were seeing that in the city, and I know Allison will talk more about that. I think it was something that was cutting across both at the city and the state level, this focus on equity. The city, for the first time, created an office of racial and social equity, the first equity officer. And so I think this notion of how we address equity became front and center. And I think because of a lot of the actions at the federal level, we started thinking about things very differently. One of the things we've said throughout our work is that poor public policy got us to where we are, so good public policy is a key part of how we address those inequities. And when we look at how, as a nation, we have such a limited safety net, and how we were able to look at doing things that we thought were never possible, giving people cash to pay for their basic needs. That's something that is not that revolutionary in other parts of the world. But we did not, we were not doing things like cash assistance. The fact that we, did cash assistance, the fact that we were willing to, look at providing key safety net issues in a way that we never have before. I don't think we should, we're now looking at things like expanding EITC and child tax credits, et cetera. So I think that, COVID has amplified a focus on equity and has also helped us to provide solutions that we never thought were possible. And I hope that we, not only here in Chicago, but around the nation, will look at those examples, recognize we can do some of these things differently, and look at what is it that we need to do to put some of these things in place that really puts equity front and center in the way that we look at our public policy.
Yeah. Joe?
interesting. I think we all sort of come from the same motivations and aspirations, but we have slightly different calibrations of our lenses based on what we do day in and day out, as I listen to Martin and Helene. And I want to take this opportunity at the outset to do something I'm not known for doing, is thanking a public official, a city official. And I want to thank Allison.
Thank you.
Thank you. We don't know, we would get through this, but I can't imagine how we get through it with a sense of confidence that we will get through it without her leadership. So thank you. What the experience has brought to me is an amplification of something that I've always been aware of, and that's both the fragility of people and their lives and the fragility of institutions. We think this machine, the machine of government, just goes. And we as people, generally as citizens, do so with little to no appreciation of what goes into it. And as a result, there's a tendency not to give the due attention, care, and feeding of the rigor of those institutions and how they operate, especially in sort of iterative fashion over time. And this has been a gigantic stress test of our institutions and a stress test of the values that go into those institutions. And so what this did is reanimate my sense and my staff's sense of the importance of good governance and the importance of good public administration, which is why it's great to be here. And in the context of the day-to-day work that we do, one other thing that's sort of tied to that fragility, the thing that holds it all together, no matter how good the systems are people and the connection that people have. And that is one of the things that COVID has taken from us as we moved to virtual environments and working. And Helene, I absolutely agree. I agree with the sentiment that we learned all sorts of new ways of doing things that we've always done without having much thinking that we needed to do about how we would effectuate them. But the other part of it is an appreciation that our best selves is sort of the collective, the sum of the parts, not just of the people doing their transactional work, but what happens when people are together. And that has been the true struggle for me, emotionally, professionally, communally. And so I'm very, very grateful for government in a time of need, more so than I have ever been, and the importance of good governance and good public administration.
Dr. Arwady, I wonder, how has the pandemic changed your work, per se?
Just a little.
I mean, it's the same, right?
Yeah.
Nothing new.
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me, especially Sadia and Will. I did do the Civic Leadership Academy here through U of C and Harris, and although I'd had a lot of education outside Illinois, really in a lot of ways, actually, that experience was pretty important for me thinking about how the city and the county work and don't work, and having some space to actually do that reimagining before I needed to be in a major leadership role. So just thanks for that, and thanks for hosting. So yeah, this was a little bit of a change. For those who don't know, I had been at the Chicago Department of Public Health for about 5 years before COVID broke out. And my whole life before this, like once I learned about infectious diseases and outbreaks and that this was something you could study for your career, I was hooked. When I did my Master's of Public Health, I actually focused in the history and ethics of public health and medicine. I've always had a lot of interest, not just in the science and the direct impacts of infectious disease outbreaks, but these indirect effects and sort of how we make decisions that are ethical and how we think about the ways in which decisions about disease, which can seem very based in science, are often as much about who we are and what we value as a community. And I had worked internationally, actually a number of different times, including with the CDC, and I'd worked at the state level. But really when I started working locally, I was like, this is what I want to do, local public health. And in 2019, actually right around when Mayor Lightfoot came in, the prior commissioner, Julie Marita, who I loved, left, and I moved into an acting role. And the whole second half of 2019 was me trying to do two jobs, the acting commissioner role, the chief medical officer role, because I actually had trouble getting confirmed by city council. And 2020 was supposed to be my year to come off that crazy time of 2019. But instead, I did get confirmed by City Council in January of 2020, and then 4 days later, the Chicago Department of Public Health activated for COVID. And so I have had no experience in this role that has not been first and foremost about this pandemic. But just to, when you think about all the ways that this has changed, right, I no longer have to explain what an epidemiologist is. I no longer have to, we've used words like essential workers that mean something different than it did 18 months ago, I think in really important long-term ways. Even the role of public health, people who go into public health generally are not really looking for fame and fortune. I think you could pretty universally say that. But most of our work goes very unnoticed. You only notice public health when it's a problem. However, here comes COVID. And so I think for me, for my whole department, and really for the broader health ecosystem in Chicago, it has been every week, every month, an opportunity to actually reimagine how we do things because we had to, right? And so whether it's needing to more quickly hire and stand up the McCormick Center, that was not in anybody's plan for how to do stand up an alternate care center. We had done a lot of emergency preparedness planning, but the scale and the speed with which this hit was sort of not something that we had ever really contemplated for real. And even though I knew a lot about the history of outbreaks and I had seen the indirect impacts, it's really different when you're visiting somewhere or they're assigned from CDC, for example, for a 6-week or 3-month deployment versus your home. And so having the responsibility to try to get this city with so many partners through this in as unscathed a way as possible, both on the sort of science and direct impact, but also the indirect, has been just this unexpected challenge. And we are only where we are in Chicago because so many people stepped up in every way that they knew how. And it is that sort of positive collaboration, we'll have hopefully a little bit of chance to talk about some examples, that I think have led us to do different things here. And really, even within city government, say there are better and different things to do this. And I have a voice that I previously did not have within city government, even within Chicago, and I take that really seriously when we're thinking about how to take long-term goals of the health department. We had a focus on the racial life expectancy gap even before COVID, but it wasn't talked about very much. There is now an opportunity, I hope, with health at the center to do things differently and make some difficult decisions, and we've been doing that for 18 months and more, so hopefully we'll keep doing it.
I want to jump into the next section for the panel. I want you folks to think through how 3 big ideas would affect the domain that you work in, and in other domains as well. So the 3 ideas are creating a city charter, changing the structure of the city council, establishing an elected school board in Chicago. So those are the 3. So time to put on our thinking caps. Inspector General Ferguson, I'll start with you. You've argued that a city charter could be beneficial for Chicago. We don't have one. So tell us, first of all, what is a city charter, so everyone's clear?
We are the only of the 10 largest cities in the United States that don't have a charter. A charter is a constitution for a city. A constitution is a higher law, a law that can't be changed by the whims of elected leaders to serve the interests of the moment. It states principles, standards, It sets the balance of power among institutions. It may define the institutions itself, but at core, we operate without a foundation. We could not imagine this country operating without a constitution, and yet this city operates without a constitution. And as a result, we're something of a traveling on a road that doesn't have guardrails and doesn't have lane dividers. You can see, and ultimately, therefore, things are determined by who wields the power and how that power is wielded. And right now, in this moment, for the city, and actually always for the city, there is an extraordinary concentration of power in the executive. And one thing that I think most people would recognize from their own life and life in general is good decisions aren't made, and they're certainly not made for very long, by a single individual without the tension that's sometimes conflict, but is always the essential tension necessary for creativity, to find our way to third ways when we are in a rut and when we are up against it. And so some of the things that a charter would specify, and there is no one way and there is no right and wrong way, but it would specify who the municipal level elected leaders are. It would specify the size of the city council. It would specify how the council operates. It would specify some aspects on the standards, principle, and process for what constitutes a balanced budget and how we actually pass budgets. It could also specify that the magnitude of certain public policy decisions with huge financial impact have to go to the people. And it would also specify, because most charters specify, that the people themselves, and let me just say, the process of creating a charter is something that involves the people. There would be equitable inputs resulting in a determination by the community as a whole as to what an equitable process is leading to equitable outcomes. It doesn't specify the what we do in the face of the challenges that we carry from the past and that we are facing in the immediate future, but it would tell us on the basis of collective decisions, who makes the decisions and how we make those decisions. All of these things are baked into that sort of foundational document that can't be overridden by elected leaders, and that if we wanted to change it, have to be changed by the people themselves.
To that end, Dr. Arwady, do you see a city charter being beneficial for the health department?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never considered it as a specific topic. I think it's certainly an example of where you see other cities that have done this and perhaps seen improvements with it. I certainly think it's worth looking at. You know, there are a lot of things I've learned that we haven't maybe looked at as a city in a long time. You know, I'm a little closer to the city planning process, right?
Okay.
For the first time in more than half a century. We've also been operating, you know, for that long, as you know, really without a plan, where the departments are coming together and you're trying to pull this. And it's a multi-year process to say, what does it actually look like? How do you pull an impact? How do you actually try to recognize that you are representing, you know, the will of the people at the most basic level? So I'm more familiar with thinking of it in that context, but I do think the ability to have some more structures and input and actually just conversation about how we govern ourselves would generally be welcome, and I think it has been helpful so far in that plan conversation, and you know, certainly would be interested in more.
Martin, what are your thoughts? What do you think of a city charter and its potential impact for education or beyond?
Sure. No, thank you for the question. I mean, I think I look at the mayor's recent budget announcement and the priorities that she's making with the resources available to the city of Chicago, both through its own revenue sources and the revenue provided by the federal government. And I think it is her best attempt to meet the moment with not enough revenue to cover all of the things that I think she would want to prioritize, all the different ways in which she'd want to help children and families. And I think she's trying to maximize that to the best of her ability. I'd say one of the challenges working with federal resources in this regard, right? I think people see states and cities get billions of dollars in federal relief, and so you think, well, this is a moment, right? This is an opportunity for us to really bolster what we're doing and head in a different direction. And I think the challenge operationally to that is that these are temporary resources, right? That $2 billion, $3 billion that's coming for education, there's a cliff several years out where that funding is not there. And if the mayor and the city council haven't identified alternative revenue sources to back that up, it's difficult to think beyond the short-term use of that money and to create things that are sustainable. And so as city planners try and leverage the resources that they have and provide pandemic relief, I think it's just as challenging having some of this federal funding come in because we're still hamstrung with their ability to do long-term planning.
Let's talk about council structure, the second piece of those three big ideas. As we heard earlier in the program, Phoenix has this council manager system. The mayor doesn't have nearly the same powers as the mayor of Chicago does. Toronto used to have 50 city council members. They scaled that back down to 20. It has its benefits, it has its drawbacks. It seems to be working somewhat for them. Joe, do you think that our current council system is benefiting the people who live in Chicago?
I can make an argument that it is benefiting them in a small way, but not benefiting them in a big way. Having 50 aldermen means that interests are represented at a micro level, at a true community level in ways that would not be the case if we had a smaller council. On the other hand, it's actually responsible, I think in some measure, for the ineffectual operation of the council itself. Aldermen don't need to think about the greater interests of the city because they need only to think about the interests of the 50,000 or so residents, a tiny percentage of whom will vote. So it's really about 3,500 people who they need to get reelected in some wards. That's tiny. And because it is so atomized, there's also a tendency for those wards to be fairly monoculture, monolithic in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, in terms of race and ethnicity. And so what you end up with is a sort of cacophony and no requirement for aldermen to think about what the larger interests of the community and what good policy would look like that serve the interests of the larger city. So I think there would be a very, very different dynamic, separate and apart from things that need to be done to make the council an effective legislative body of itself. The sheer number needs to be talked about simply for a discussion about whether it's calibrated for the best interests of the city in the way that we collectively see the best interests of the city.
Helene, in your work at the Chicago Community Trust, you're focused on reinvesting in communities that haven't seen adequate investment in recent years at all. Even decades, right? And so since we are talking about these systems and these institutions in Reimagine Chicago, I wonder what structural issues you see that continue to drive that disinvestment. And what's the role of politics in that?
Yeah, so, and maybe I'll harken back to the other question as well. I mean, I do think all of these are very interrelated. I didn't know about a city charter until, we heard about it for this panel, and we got a crash course from Joe before coming up here. But I do think the fact that we don't have a city charter, we don't have a city plan, we have so many aldermen that are carved up. You take a community like Englewood where there's 6 different aldermen who represent one community. It is hard to see how you can make good decisions about how to invest in the city as a whole when we're as carved up as we are, where there's no overarching plan and there's no overarching foundation on which to build. So I think politics has a huge part of it, but it's not politics in the sense of, how are we politicking, but it is how do we make sure that we have an accountable system, a system that has a foundation and some clear rules, and that we have representation that incentivizes thinking about the whole city, not just my own power dynamics, and how do I make sure that I get my own? And so I do think that this move to thinking about, can we look at Chicago as a whole city, and as everybody knows, somebody's greatest strength, also their greatest weakness. Neighborhoods in Chicago. We all love the fact that this is a city of neighborhoods, but that's also one of the things that I think tears away and chips away at the unity that we could have as a city. So, I think all the things that people have said about how do we push to have a very clear sense of what's the foundation, what are the ground rules, how do we think about processes, but how do we also think about, looking at this as a citywide effort, balancing the needs of the city. We know that you cannot leave, 2/3 of the city behind and expect that the whole city is going to move forward. And that's what we've done for decades and decades with the kind of disinvestment that we've had. So we've got to think about, how do we get people to think about Chicago as a whole city and not as a fractionated part? And how do we incentivize people to think that way so that they're not thinking about, how do I make sure that I get the greatest power grab for my small part of the city?
So are there some specific changes, Helene, that you would make to Chicago City Council that would have them operate?
I think the redistricting effort that's going on, we're supporting Change Illinois and thinking about redistricting, thinking about how do you, you've got to have districts, you've got to have councils, you've got to have jurisdictions, but how do you do that in a way that really thinks about again, the city as a whole in a different way. So I think that the gerrymandering that has gone on, that has led to these kind of, as you said, atomized, portions of the city, those are the things that I think would be good to think about. And, people talk about aldermanic prerogative. So it's a term that is emotionally laden, but I do think we need to think about how do we incentivize thinking about things as a whole.
So let's move now to establishing an elected school board in Chicago, which we know it's passed the Illinois legislature and it's in the works. But Martin, I want to come back to you. After years of having an appointed board, Chicago is going to soon have an elected school board. So for people out there who aren't familiar with the change, can you fill them in?
Sure. So this past spring, the legislature finally passed a tough negotiated bill to create an elected school board in the city of Chicago. So in 2025, we will see a transition from a 7-member appointed school board to a 21-member hybrid board, where 11 of the board members are appointed by the mayor and 10 are elected during the 2024 general election. That hybrid model will operate for 2 years, and then in 2027, you will have 21 elected members of the Chicago School Board. There will be 20 districts where those folks will be elected from, and 1 at-large president. And I think here's what the research sees. The research says that there isn't a definitive decision on whether or not student achievement is improved through an appointed governance model or through an elected model. So I think when it comes to what do we expect the outcome to be, I think the literature would tell us the jury's out. I think what we will see is a system that reflects probably the will of the voters of the city of Chicago. An elected school board is the standard model of governance for schools. And let's think about what school boards do, right? They set strategic mission and objectives. They define assessments and curricula. They have an incredibly important job, and yet it's unclear which model of governance is superior.
You talked a little bit about the impact on kids. I wonder how you feel it would impact the teachers.
Sure. I mean, I think when you have a more representative system like that, I think you're going to have a lot of stakeholders who are invested in the electoral process. I think that's what you see when you look at Los Angeles Unified School District, for example, where you have some races for school board in the millions of dollars because there are special interests that are coming in who want to affect the outcome of what that will look like. One of the issues that wasn't addressed in this legislation was campaign finance. And that's just one of the issues that I think will get addressed in a trailer bill, probably in the spring, but perhaps in the years to come. And with 21 electeds at large, less than half the size of the city council, you're going to see, probably races that cost amounts similar to what you see for aldermanic races, right? I mean, we're talking about the same media market, the same strategies to target voters, and I think students will see more of a public dialogue around their lives. I think a potential increase in voter turnout from generation and over time.
Before we wrap up our panel, I want to check in with you two on the end there. Doctor, first of all, a lot of parents, myself included, were concerned about sending our kids to school in person. Given this Delta variant, it's nerve-wracking. I talked to you about this, moments before our panel discussion, but do you expect that an elected school board would have an impact on how CPS approaches the pandemic?
So I think time will tell. 21 is a big number in terms of we're thinking about a lot of voices already in these spaces. And I do think that in a lot of ways in Chicago, the conversation around COVID in schools has been perhaps the hottest sort of political conversation, right? Different than you look around the country, and I think there's been a lot more unrest in general and debate around the directions things should go, masks, et cetera. I think here in this city, especially and at the state level, we've worked quite hard to try to have the story not be the politics when it comes to COVID decisions. I think Mayor Lightfoot, for example, absolutely, whether it was the yay, we're opening or oh, we're closing decision, did that together with me. Around the country, we often saw elected officials blame the hard decisions on the health commissioners and own the happy decisions. And I think here, one of the reasons that I think we have not seen quite as much discord is that there has been the willingness at the city and the state and the county levels to say, we're going to do this in a way that we're owning it together. But I think particularly the school conversation in Chicago has been, it is always a fraught decision. We were talking a little bit about some of the union politics even before, and there's a lot of forces at play. I think for me and for the health department and COVID specifically, I always see my role as what do we know about this question from a data-driven perspective. And in the case of, bringing kids back to school, it surprised us that, in fact, we didn't see schools be the major source of spread that we honestly anticipated they would be. I was really worried at the beginning of last school year, seeing all these schools go back, and thinking about, is this going to drive it like we expected it would for influenza? But the truth is it really didn't. And I think for reasons that go beyond just COVID safety, there's a lot of debate about who makes the decisions related to schools here. And, my goal is to make sure that parents are hearing and everyone is hearing that the risks are never going to be zero, right? There is no such thing as a zero risk setting for COVID. I cannot guarantee that a given child will never get COVID. But what I can say is that even where we've seen, yes, there have been 500 plus cases already reported in Chicago public schools since they've come back in a population of more than 300,000. And that is not only is it not 1 in 100 children, it's not 1 in 1,000, it's not 1 in 10,000. It's like 5 or 6 in 100,000 at this point. I expect those numbers will go up as there's more testing happening. But I think this issue of risk and using people's fears, particularly around their children, have raised debate in this conversation. And I've been really pleased to be able to give, I hope, factual information to the Chicago Teachers Union, to the Chicago Public Schools, to the other school systems here. And try to not get embroiled in some of those politics. But I think, with this move, we'll see what those changes are.
We'll see. Before we turn it over to the audience, Joe, I want to know if you see this move to an elected school board reverberating through Chicago in other ways.
I think the most remarkable thing in all of the discussion about an elected school board is what I just heard. I heard two incredibly well-informed, engaged, involved officials say, I don't know. And part of the reason, I think, looking at why they don't know, is we did not approach this holistically. We did not approach this from the perspective of what the outcome is that we actually want. And then think about what sort of school board, not only how we selected the school board, but what it was constituted of, and revisit what powers it would actually have. So a real sort of fine-tuning of the powers of a 21-person school board. Is it simply, and I know that there's some of that discussion, but we haven't had the holistic discussion, which also gets us into something that I think Martin teased, and appropriately so, is when he talks about some districts requiring millions of dollars to get elected. Absolutely, we're talking about campaign financing, which absolutely raises the question of whether we're going to have equity in the outcomes here, or whether we're going to have an agency capture situation in which the prevailing power bases simply utilize their greater knowledge and resources to affect the same outcome that the elected school board was supposed to actually avoid. And so that holistic approach is something, back to the original framing, that a charter process would actually set some foundational standards and processes and ground rules for when we create a governmental body. And I will say from my experience, contrary to free speech, and where the remedy for problematic speech is more speech, the remedy for problematic governance is seldom more and bigger governance. It's better governance. And one thing about charters as they exist in other municipalities is that they have a provision that says every 5 or 10 years we're going to look at how things are working. A new charter commission is charged of the people saying what's working, what are the outcomes that we're not achieving, and turn the screws to make it work better. But I don't know the answer either. I'm worried that it's going to be Chicago'd to death.
Well, if that wasn't a mic drop, I don't know what is. Where do I go from there? No, great discussion, guys. Now that we've talked about these three ideas, I do want to open it up to our audience, and I'm looking at you right here in this room first. What is your big idea for reimagining Chicago that you think could make this city work better for the people who live here? So if you've got something to say, grab the mic. Dylan's standing there with the microphone. For those on the live stream, you can drop us a note in the live stream comments box. You can send us a message on Twitter. Use the hashtag #ReimagineChicagoCapstone, and we'll hear some of your ideas and get thoughts from the panelists as well. And if you have a question, anyone up here can also answer those.
Good evening. I'm actually captivated with the charter idea, and so I want to just rattle off a handful of things and ask, would this have been affected? So I'm thinking about our pension commitments, which are then not funded. I'm thinking about the fact that we're sitting in a ward in which 3 of the last 5 aldermen have been convicted of federal crimes. I'm thinking about the sale of the Skyway. I'm thinking about the sale of our parking meters. And lastly, I'm thinking about waking up one morning and seeing that Meigs Field had been destroyed overnight at the decision of one person. And I'm just thinking, as a citizen of the city, are these the kinds of things that would be dealt with in a more constructive way under, the structure of a charter?
Sasha, you want me to jump into that?
Oh, jump right in.
Right.
That was for you.
Right.
They're not talking to me.
So, no outcomes guaranteed, but as a matter of process and standards, absolutely, I believe that a charter would affect all the things that you're talking about. Let's take the Skyway and the parking meters. We're talking about concessions there. The parking meters in particular, while it was long negotiated, it was introduced to the council and then voted on 48 hours later. This massive public asset given away, and we all know the outcome there. Was it a bad deal? Well, in retrospect, sure, it looks like a bad deal. The problem is not that it was a bad deal, it was that we didn't have process that would say whether or not it would be a bad deal. So, referencing New York City, for example, that sort of proposal would have been required to go to either the comptroller or the equivalent of a congressional budget office. There's a legislative budget office there. It would have to be scored. That information would have to go to the council. The council would then have a rigorous debate and discussion with all the experts coming in. And given the size of it, if it were in New York City, it may have to go to a referendum. We would not make that mistake in the same way, driven by the power, the power centricity of the mayor's office as it exists right now. With respect to pensions, the answer is yes. There would be standards for budgeting that would have to account for our situation with pensions, and there would have to be this scoring of the outcome of the collective of union agreements that lead to these outcomes to say what we're doing as a whole. I'll give you a quick example. The Department of Water has is staffed by people in 17 separate unions with 17 separate collective bargaining agreements. They're all negotiated individually and not collect with thoughts of what the collective holistic outcome is going to be. As to corruption, right now we're seeing in the context of the Park District what a bad IG looks like, and I'd like to say you're looking at a good IG, right? But there's a wide variation in a city in which we have all different versions of IG without the resources being combined that's consonant and equated with the way that power is actually held in the city. And so corruption actually would probably have sort of a different affect and look. I'd like to say that actually the reason that this looks like a bad corruption moment in Chicago is because we're moving in the right direction and we're catching more of this. But the fact of the matter is that hasn't been looked at holistically either.
Yeah, just one other thing I would add, you know, one aspect of this we have not talked about is the voices of people and the accountability that I think is important for people to hold governments accountable. But you don't have people holding government accountable when they've given up. And I think some of the things that we've talked about, some of the solutions, and you know, I don't think anybody up here says that they have the absolute answer, but I think if we can build a government that people believe in, we then get people more willing to use their voice, be involved, vote, you know, be active in their communities. And so I think we can't forget how important it is to have a government that people feel actually delivers for them, because that's when I think we have the kind of balance of power that comes with citizens exercising their right and their ability to hold you know, government accountable.
Let's go to a question from Daniel on YouTube. He says, to expand on Helene's comment, what if we had a unified 5 or 11 county regional government, looking at the well-being of the entire region? So since you were mentioned there, Helene, what do you think of that? Could that kind of big structural change improve people's lives?
Well, yeah, I do think that, you know, we've talked a lot about the city, but we're part of a region, and we're part of a very interconnected region. And I think that we will move forward faster and better if we think about ourselves in a regional sense and not just as a, you know, metropolitan.
Could it improve equity across the region?
Yeah, and I think it would. You know, we know that you know, equity in our region is a big challenge, and we can't solve that just by looking at the city. I don't know, you know, I'm not the one to say, you know, this particular structure is the right one, but I do think as we look at this from a regional perspective, we have a lot greater chance of having greater equity and greater accountability.
Martin, you work in the governor's office. Could it make it easier to coordinate between the governor's office and the region?
I mean, when I think about a regional government, I immediately go to what are the operational challenges of making that work, right? And if you thought about it from a county standpoint, do all of the county leaders agree with the central premise and objective that they're coming together for, right? What are the decision-making structures that would allow them to move things forward? Are they making equal financial commitments to pursue their objectives? What can support those things? And I think it's difficult for different units of government that have different accountability and electoral structures to do that effectively. I think, you know, if you have something like the RTA where it's a very specific, finite thing, there is a specific tangible task that they're all working on together, I think something that's targeted like that can work. I think it's demonstrated that it has worked. I think if you have something that's global, I think the challenge is how do you narrow things down to something that's tangible that you can actually accomplish?
This is a very interesting question from Daniel. I'm coming to you, Doctor. What do you think?
I was just going to add on to this that I think, in public health, largely because we flew under the radar, we actually are quite used to working sort of in a regional way and across boundaries. But there are a lot of ways in which everything from funding to data is extraordinarily siloed at different levels. And where I think about sort of this post-COVID reimagining, it's everything from, I, for example, believe that where public health data is by law needs to be reported to the state, that it should by law automatically be available to the local health department with the appropriate securities around it, as opposed to each time needing to go through a legal exchange. And I believe that when I'm working on an outbreak with Cook County, we should be able to, again, appropriately protecting privacy, be able to exchange some of that. We have a lot of legal things in place that make that sort of work difficult. And we also, because of the way we fund, we haven't talked very much about the mental health space, but that's a space we work in a whole lot as a city. And even just understanding where the city is funding compared to where the county is funding, compared to where the state is funding, compared to where there's federal funding coming in, and wanting to make sure that all of that public funding is being used in ways that complement each other. It sounds straightforward, but it's not. And so I don't, some of it could be regional government, but some of it is also, frankly, about some more visibility into the need for coordination of funding and data across levels.
What do you think about this type of change?
We have to be thinking about it for this reason. A lot of our thinking around this have to do with existing problems and problems that we carry from the past, but we have to be thinking about different levels of government, which is ironic in Illinois because we have way too many levels of government already. But that's because the problems that are immediately upon us, that are climate related, sustainability, resilience, those are regional issues. The Chicago area will be a climate refuge going forward because of climate change and because the water is here. And we recently had had a competition as to who was going to supply water to another area, another municipality in the region. It was a competition, and it really should be wrought of a decision about how we are handling that scarce and important resource in a regional way that actually makes it possible for us to anticipate the problems that actually are coming at us.
This sounds like a good time for Anissa's question from YouTube. She says, what would it look like if Chicago prioritized just sustainability as a lens and a success metric? What do you think, Helene?
I don't think we can prioritize just one issue, but I think sustainability is so interconnected with so many other issues. So it has to be high on the priority list. There's not a business today that's operating that doesn't think about sustainability goals. For the reasons that Joe said, we know that this is one of the biggest problems that is facing, our city, our region, our nation, and our world. So it has to be a priority. But I don't think that I don't think thinking about issues as siloed single issues without thinking about the interconnectedness of these issues. The sustainability is connected to economy, which is connected to education, which is connected to health. And I think if we start thinking about these issues as how they're interconnected, we'll be better at coming up with solutions.
I think, on second thought here, I think Anissa may have meant just as in justice.
And I'll respond to that. Where we are right now is not sustainable. All right, put aside the enterprise of sustainability, the business of sustainability, because everything gets monetized in our culture. Think about where we are right now. The inequity of this city is not sustainable, and we are seeing the consequences of that all over the place in our streets, okay? And so if you take sustainability as a value when we pass policy, and Martin made a really important observation, that in this moment where there's massive federal money coming, we're creating new programs and reaching out in new and very important ways, but have we applied the sustainability metric to that and figured out how it is we're going to fund some of these things next year and the year after? That's the financial one, but thinking in the moment from a criminal justice perspective, where we are, we know is not sustainable, and we're seeing the consequences. So it's an important value.
Let's get two more questions, given the time. Cindy from YouTube asks, is the panel aware of any cities where key performance indicators and strategic plans are used effectively? Looking at you again, Joe.
No. That's simple. No. That's not we don't have that as a value. And that's turning back to earlier, how we go about budgeting, how we make policy, the balance of power that exists between the branches, and the form of engagement that happens between those branches. One of the things that I will tell you that the City Council, our City Council does not demand are success metrics. Okay, you're putting this before us. How is it that we're going to be measuring success, and what are the metrics for success? That the City Council itself, the elected members, few of them are going to be sophisticated enough, so then that gets you to how the council itself operates and whether there are other components of government that are actually scoring and testing and holding to baseline standards, some of which can be written into the Constitution, some of them can be stated as sort of broader value, sorry, the Constitution, the Charter, some of them that it's stated as values rather than specific things, but right now we are nowhere where we need to be with respect to metrics to tell us we're on the right path.
I will add, though, you know, I think that there's more and more discussion about looking at goals that are global goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals, as an example, where, you know, the United States has never thought of itself as thinking about that it's part of the rest of the world. I think people are now starting to realize that, you know, if we want to look at outcomes and look at, you know, where are we getting for some of these big challenges that we face, looking at things like the UN Sustainability Goals or other sort of metrics are really important to drive thinking, you know, not just about inputs, which we're used to thinking about in government, but how do we actually think about outputs and where we want to be? And so I think that, you know, it's actually, for me, optimistic to see more and more people starting to talk about global goals like Sustainable Development Goals and others, where we are looking at not just what are the inputs, and what are the short-term measures, but how are we actually thinking about goals that we want to achieve as a city, as a nation, as a region?
Yeah, and I would add that at least in my experience, we do plenty of KPIs and outcomes, at a department level, like with a very health focus, right? And we are very used to being in a data-driven space. I think when you try to think about all of the pieces, if we take it back to the city level, all of the different departments that are doing a host of different things. And for example, I think there has been a very serious effort to say, what does it mean to put health and racial equity, right, at the center of what we are doing as a city? Like, that is not just lip service, I think partly because of COVID, but how you measure that, what those outcomes are, I think is one of the challenges. And so what's been really interesting, though, is that historically, I think there was a sense that people wouldn't, maybe the general public wouldn't look at data too much, that the aldermen might not be interested, that it wasn't sophisticated enough. Look at the COVID data dashboard in the city of Chicago that has gotten millions and millions and millions of views. And we didn't necessarily expect how interested everybody in Chicago would be and continues to be in our percent positivity, our cases per day, these numbers that have really impacted our daily life. We've got a goal at the health department that people in their neighborhoods would actually know some of those same numbers for things like life expectancy, for things like access to, a lot of these other root causes, and that then we would actually be setting some of these measurable goals. It's doable, and I think it's always hard to land on something, but one of the reasons we choose things like life expectancy is you can't fudge that data. And I think choosing things where you can't fudge the data and you're making progress or you're not is critical to any actual sort of KPI setting that has a basis in, that's going to actually move the needle on things.
And just to amplify one of the things you said, I mean, I think part of it is also making it real to people's everyday lives. And it kind of goes back to my earlier comment about how important it is to actually involve citizens in some of this. I think we become better at measuring outcomes when people actually start engaging in the data and we start using data in ways that actually change people's lives and people are actually aware of it. And, you know, obviously because of COVID and you know, the necessity that it has caused people to think about these issues, it's been a great example. But we can continue to build from there and make data available to people and make it useful for people's everyday lives.
And I completely agree, but I want to add one more element to what you're each saying, because it is the case that government is really working on making good use of data. Which is tied at the department level. And again, departments are siloed in the city in terms of their operation, tied to metrics. And in public health, absolutely extraordinary work done on that front by the city's Department of Public Health and at the state level as well. But I think it's the job of government to translate what intuitively constitutes success for the communities, which only comes from engaging the communities at the front end as to what really matters to them, translate that to metrics, hard metrics that then get reduced to data in friendly forms, visualizations, you do it, we do it, with respect to criminal justice, that actually empowers people. It closes the loop and creates a cycle for engagement that is exactly what we need right now if we're going to all get pulling in the same direction.
Well, that is a wrap. I want to say a huge thank you to our wonderful in-person audience and everyone who was watching and chiming in from home. On behalf of WBEZ and the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, a special thank you to our panelists, Helene Gale from the Chicago Community Trust, Martin Torres from the Pritzker Administration, Chicago Inspector General Joe Ferguson, and Commissioner of Chicago's Department of Public Health, Dr. Allison Arwoody. Thank you all so much. A round of applause. And thank you again to Professor William Howell, Sadia Sindhu, and the entire team at the Center for Effective Government for your partnership on the series. Special thanks to the Harris School of Public Policy for hosting tonight's wonderful event in this beautiful space. And thank you for joining us in person, for doing this on a, what night is this? Oh, on a Wednesday. Oh, don't thank me. No. You know, joining us in person, tuning in wherever you are right now, you know, putting your dinner aside to listen to this conversation and share your ideas with us. You can catch Reset every weekday at 11 o'clock. That's where I am. We're on the dial at 91.5 FM. Stream us live at wbez.org/live. And you can learn more about the Center for Effective Government by visiting effectivegov at uchicago.edu. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.